Hare Krishna. A blind falsehood impertinently repeated in accounts of Akbar's reign is that he had abolished the pernicious jizya tax. This tax was extracted by India's alien Muslim rulers from their Hindu subjects, who formed the vast majority, on the specious plea that India was a Muslim country, and since the ruler, out of generosity and sufferance, allowed a vast majority to practice a different religion from that of the rulers, they must pay through their nose for such sufferance. This therefore was nothing but religious blackmail and robbery perpetrated by the ruler on his helpless subjects. Akbar, far from being an abolisher of the jizya tax, extracted it with all vengeance. One clause of the Ranthambore Treaty stipulated for special exemption from the jizya tax for the Bundi ruler. Bundi was a territory. Again, in connection with the visit of a Jain monk, Hira Vijayasuri, we hear that he again asked for exemption of the jizya. That proves that people were compelled off and on to ask for special exemption from the jizya. Moreover, even if Akbar might have sent an occasional visitor across the court threshold, happy in the thought that the visitor's request for exemption from jizya had been sanctioned, we have by now learnt enough of Akbar's ways to believe that it was anything but an empty assurance from a wily host. Far from the angel that he is being represented to be in Bharatiya history, Akbar was perhaps the world's most hated person. Such was the resentment that everybody felt, that numerous persons from his own son Jahangir downwards attempted to murder Akbar. Smith describes on page 220, quote, "Throughout the year 1602, the Prince Salim continued to hold court at Allahabad and to maintain royal state as the king of the provinces which he had usurped. He emphasized his claim to royalty by striking both gold and copper money specimens, of which he had the impudence to send to his father Akbar. He sent his adherent Dost Muhammad to Kabul as his envoy to negotiate with Akbar." Unquote. On page 232 and 237, Smith tells us that Jahangir's rebellion, if successful, must have resulted in his parents' death. In a footnote on Akbar's death, it is stated that, quote, "It is certain that Salim ardently desired his father's demise." Unquote. A footnote on page 191 says, quote, "As early as 1591 AD, when Akbar was suffering for a time from stomachache and colic, he expressed suspicion that his eldest son had poisoned him. Prince Salim, means Jahangir, who became tired of waiting for the crown, wished to obtain Portuguese support in his intended fight for the throne." Unquote. Smith also tells the reader that Akbar usually had a rebellion somewhere or the other on his hands, and the unrecorded outbreaks of disorder in the provinces summarily dealt with by the Fauzdars must have been innumerable. Among Akbar's own supporters who revolted against him one by one were Behram Khan, Khan Jaman, Asaf Khan, Shah Mansur, the finance minister, and all the Mirzas, that is, blood relations of the royal family. On page 250, Smith tells us of historian Wheeler's assertion that Akbar kept a paid official whose duty was to poison people who incurred Akbar's fatal displeasure. According to some historians, Akbar died of poison pills he mistakenly took, which had intended for Mansingh. In a footnote, Smith lists persons who were secretly executed or poisoned by Akbar. Number 1. Secret execution of Kamran's son at Gwalior, 1565. Number 2. The highly suspicious deaths of Makhdum-e-Mulk and Sheikh Abdur Nabi after their return from Mecca. The Iqbalnama expressly states that the latter was put to death by Abul Fazl in pursuance of Akbar's orders. Number 3. The equally suspicious death of Masum Farhan Ghudi. Number 4. Execution of Mir Muizul Mulk and another by their boat foundering. Number 5. One by one Akbar sent to death all mullahs against whom he had suspicions stated by Badayuni. To this list, the author P.N. Oak has added the murder of Bairam Khan and of Jaimal, whose widows Akbar chased as having been murdered at Akbar's behest, as appears from the circumstances of their deaths. Smith describes Akbar's punishment as, quote, sentences of appalling kind. The modes of execution included impalement, trampling by elephants, crucifixion, beheading, hanging, and others. As minor penalties, mutilation and whipping of great severity were commonly ordered. No records of proceedings, civil or criminal, were kept. Persons acting as judges thought fit to follow Quranic rules. Akbar encouraged trial by ordeal, unquote. The horrors of an execution ground are realistically depicted in one of the copies of the Akbarnama at South Kensington, London. Montserrat, a contemporary of Akbar, says, quote, Akbar was rather penurious and retentive of money, unquote. On page 263, Smith says, quote, the emperor regarded himself as the heir of all his subjects and ruthlessly seized the entire property of every deceased whose family had to make a fresh start, contingent on the goodwill of the emperor. Akbar was a hard-headed man of business, not a sentimental philanthropist, and his whole policy was directed principally to the acquisition of power and riches. All the arrangements about jagirs, branding horses, etc. were devised for the one purpose, namely the enhancement of the power, glory and riches of the crown, like the modern Indian political Draculas, I mean the Netas. Though Akbar's mother died just over a year before Akbar, after Akbar had made all his conquests and hoarded immense wealth through usury and repression, yet he could not resist the temptation of flouting her dying wish. Describing this on page 230, Smith says that the deceased left in her house a large treasure and a will directing that it should be divided among her male descendants. Akbar was too fond of money to withstand the temptation of annexing her wealth, the whole of which he appropriated without regard to the terms of the will. Bharat's perverted history has all along striven hard to depict Bharat's alien rulers bedecked with glories borrowed from pre-Muslim Bharatiya rulers' descriptions. A remarkable instance of such a graft is found in accounts of Akbar's reign. In imitation of what is said of King Vikramaditya, a myth assiduously foisted on medieval Bharatiya history is that Akbar had a similar galaxy of 9 talented men called the 9 gem or Navaratna of his court. That Akbar did not consider them anything better than a group of idiots is seen in a characteristic remark of his, in which he says, Quote, "It was the grace of God that I found no capable minister. Otherwise, people would have considered that my measures had been devised by them." Unquote. Even otherwise, all these much publicized men were men of no earth. Todermal was associated with devising a pernicious system of screwing money out of people, to extract which they had to be flogged, and to remit which they had to sell their wives and children. Abul Fazl had the reputation of being a shameless flatterer, and was got murdered by the Crown Prince Salim himself. Salim means Jahangir. Faizi, who died a premature death, was a mediocre poet boosted up in a court where sycophant flattery flourished at its worst. About him, Smith remarks in page 301-302, quote, "Blochman held that after Amir Khusru of Delhi, Mohammedan India has seen no greater poet than Faizi. Admitting the justice of Blochman's verdict, I can only say that the other poets of Mohammedan India must be worth very little." Unquote. Birbal died in a battle. He was supposed to have been given a jagir, which he never enjoyed. The much extolled wit, humor, and repartee ascribed to him are in fact the work of some wag who used Birbal's name and court associations as a fictitious stalking horse. Shah Mansur, the so-called finance minister, was executed at Akbar's order by Abul Fazl himself. So, from beginning to end, it is such a sickening tale that these much vaunted 9 gems, the so-called Navaratna, turn out to be helpless individuals caught up in the infernal machine of a corrupt and repressive administration. Raja Bhagwan Das once stabbed himself in disgust because of the utter misery of his situation, in which he had given many of his women folk, sons and cousins in Akbar's service, only to receive despicable treatment in return. Mansingh was throttled by an overdrunk Akbar, and subsequently was to be poisoned. But Akbar himself happened to take the poison pills by mistake. Jagat Singh drank himself to death. Man Singh's sister Manbai, married to Jahangir, was in all probability murdered, since in one edition of Jahangirnama it is stated that she fasted for 3 days and died, while in another she is stated to have committed suicide by taking poison. It is known that 3 days fasting is not enough to kill a woman, and moreover Jahangirnama itself is notorious as a tissue of lies. Jahangir himself is known to have been a very cruel and scheming monarch, who poisoned his father Akbar, got Nurjahan's first husband Sher Afghan murdered, and could look upon with pleasure at the sight of a man being flayed alive. Daswant, a young painter at Akbar's court, stabbed himself to death. All such suicides by Hindus have been represented in contemporary Muslim records as having been committed in a fit of madness. This description is literally true in another sense, namely that conditions in Mughal courts were so intolerable that the Hindus, driven to desperation by the loss of their culture, honor, property, women, sanctity of their homes, and religion, were driven to madness and death. Todermal, in spite of his having sold his conscience to Akbar in devising a system to please the subjects, had all his private altar, to which as an orthodox Hindu he was very much attached, removed together with the idols he worshipped. To an orthodox Hindu in those days, when idols were not to be touched even by persons in the same household, without a bath and holy attire, summary removal of all idols by Muslim iconoclasts was a mortifying sacrilege. And yet such acts were encouraged by Akbar, even with regard to persons like Todarmal, who had mortgaged and lost all their honor in Akbar's service. In disgust, Todarmal therefore resigned and left for Banaras. On page 58, Smith says, quote, Akbar then marched to Prayag and onto Banaras, which were plundered because people were rash enough to close their gates, unquote. This explains why Prayag has no river ghats and ancient buildings. All that Prayag, means modern Allahabad, has today is Victorian bungalows of practicing advocates. But for them, Allahabad presents a bleak appearance. As an ancient holy place, it need not be stressed that Prayag has excellent, towering river ghats on both sides of the Ganga and Jamuna, along with its magnificent fort. The demolition of Prayag's magnificent ghats, out revealing those at Banaras, and many mansions and numerous temples must be laid squarely at the door of Akbar. Contrary to popular belief, the famous Kashi Vishwanath temple at Banaras was first desecrated by Akbar when he wreaked vengeance on its people. In fact, no question of even vengeance arises. The Bharatiya people are traditionally known for their extreme devotion to royalty. Had Akbar's visit been harmless, it could not have occasioned any other feelings amongst Banaras residents, except those of the deepest reverence. But from the very fact that they slammed their doors against Akbar, it is clear that his entry into Banaras must have been occasioned by lecherous and rapacious motives. We have already seen that Akbar insisted on complete prostration by all and sundry before him. He made people drink the water in which he washed his feet. He also made people drink water on which he had breathed. Ralph Fitch, a contemporary English traveller, has recorded that William Leeds, an English jeweller at Akbar's court, was given a house and 5 slaves. On page 147, Smith says, quote, Aquaviva, the Jesuit, had obtained mere sustenance through his stay at court. Court means Akbar's court. While living, therefore, the only boon he asked was to take with him a family of Russian slaves, father, mother, 2 sons, and certain dependents who had been among Mohammedans so long as to be Christians in name only, unquote. This shows that Akbar held innumerable slaves of various nationalities. On the page 159, Smith avers that, quote, in the years 1581-82, a large number of Sikhs means Jamidars, and Fakirs, apparently those who resisted innovation, were exiled mostly to Kandahar and exchanged for horses, presumably being enslaved, unquote. Smith also describes how harem women accompanying the royal party were shut off in gilded cages. It was also a common practice to consider all prisoners after a battle to be slaves. Another very subtle method of slavery which Akbar practiced, which caused great resentment, was of branding every horse with a flower mark on its forehead. Thus, whosoever owned a branded horse automatically became subservient to Akbar. All the horses in the realm, wherever found, were branded. Thus, a man owning a horse found himself between the devil and the deep sea. If he wished to be free of Akbar's tutelage, the only way open was to let the horse loose, in which case he lost the only conveyance and beast of burden in those perilous days. And if he retained the horse, the forehead mark was a constant reminder of his having been reduced to perpetual serfdom by a cruel trick. Akbar's lawless and rapacious rule led to famines of unprecedented horror. Smith says, quote, in 1555 and 56, Delhi was devastated and the mortality was enormous. Badayuni witnessed with his own eyes that men ate their own kind, and the appearance of famished sufferers was so hideous that one could scarcely look upon them. The whole country was a desert, and no husbandman remained to till the ground. Gujarat, one of the richest provinces in Bharat, and generally reputed to be almost exempt from the risk of famine, suffered severely for 6 months in 1573 and 1574. Pestilence, as usual, followed starvation, so that inhabitants, rich and poor, fled the country and were scattered abroad. Abul Fazl, with characteristic vagueness, records that, quote, in 1583 or 84, as prices were high on account of the dryness of the year, the means of subsistence of many people came to an end, unquote. If we may judge, says Smith, from the slovenly way in which he treats the tremendous calamity of 1595 to 98, we may infer that the famine of 1583 and 84 was serious. It does not seem to be mentioned or even alluded to by other chroniclers, unquote. The famine, which began in 1595 and lasted 3 or 4 years until 1598, equaled in its horrors the accession year and excelled the vegetation by reason of its longer duration. Inundation and epidemics occasionally marred Akbar's reign, says Smith. Smith also observes that when Akbar died in Agra fort alone, he had left 20 million sterling in cash. There were similar hoards in 6 other cities, and yet Akbar does not seem to have taken any famine relief measures. Description to the contrary left by Abul Fazl are dismissed as mere flattery. It has been wrongly and falsely asserted and assumed that Akbar's marriages with Rajput princesses were brought about with the very noble aim of bringing about communal unity and harmony. This claim can be debunked by asking the simple trillion-dollar question whether Akbar ever offered his own daughters and nieces or sisters in marriage to Hindu chiefs and noblemen. Secondly, it is absurd to suggest that the brave Rajputs who preferred mass burning of their women rather than let them fail in the hands of an alien gentry given to extreme drinking, drugging, and sex orgies, felt proud of offering their daughters to Akbar and his kinsmen? Let us take the instance of the Jaipur royal family, which had to surrender many of its daughters to the Mughal rulers. An account of how the Jaipur rulers were coerced into sending their daughters to the Mughal harem is found on pages 61 to 63 of Dr. Ashrivadi Lal Srivastav's book titled, quote, Akbar the Great, Volume 1, unquote. The bane of Bharatiya historical scholarship has been the reluctance of inability to draw the right logical conclusions from all known facts. Dr. Srivastav's account of Akbar's capture of the Jaipur princess is a typical instance. The real story of how Akbar terrorized the royal house of Jaipur to part with their beloved daughter for being locked up behind a burqa in a teeming Mughal harem has been carefully torn to bits and conveniently swept under the royal rug of Akbar's bedchamber. We shall piece together the fragments of that host of story. Sharfuddin was one of Akbar's commanders who organized several raids against Amber, means Old Jaipur, then ruled by Raja Bharmal. Besides extracting a large tribute, Sharfuddin was able to capture three of Bharmal's nephews, Jagannath, Raja Singh and Khangar. They were kept as hostages and obviously threatened with torturous death at an out of the way place called Sambhar. Dr. Srivastav says, quote, the Kachua chief Bharmal faced extinction and hence in a helpless condition sought the intercession of an alliance with Akbar, unquote. This clearly shows that surrendering of an innocent, helpless princess was made a precondition by Akbar for the release of Bharmal's three nephews. Accordingly, the princess was surrendered at Sambar and the release of the three princes was secured in exchange. In addition, a large sum of money had again to be paid. Obviously, on the Jaipur side, this humiliating episode had to be glossed over and whitewashed as a marriage, and the tribute paid had to be euphemistically described as dowry. But there is no reason why scholars of modern India who want to become Vishwaguru should feel compelled to perpetuate the diabolical myth. A billion-dollar question indeed. Dr. Srivastav has further stated that, quote, after a day's stay at Sambhar, Akbar marched rapidly to Agra, unquote. Near Ranthambore, Bharmal's sons, daughters and other relatives were introduced to Akbar. These lurid details put the whole episode into bold relief. It is well-known fact that in the 16th century, a royal wedding was an elaborate affair lasting for months. And yet, Akbar had no more time to spare than a day's wayside halt for this pseudo-marriage. And obviously, none of Bharmal's relatives attended the humiliating surrender of a royal princess' honor and chastity, as is apparent from the fact that Bharmal's sons, daughters, grandsons and other relatives were introduced to Akbar at Ranthambore. It was this initial marital grief which enabled the Mughals to force Jaipur to part with its other daughters on demand later. As soon as Bharmal had been forced to cede his daughter to Akbar, the latter put his commander Sharfuddin on another similar blackmailing mission, namely the reduction of the principality of Marta. All marital connections with other Rajput ruling households were the result of similar coercion. History is replete with instances of many helpless daughters and sisters being wrenched away under the very nose of reluctant and helpless parents and guardians by Mansingh and other henchmen of Akbar. These abductions and kidnappings have been glorified in history as Akbar's noble intercommunal marriages brought about with the lofty aim of bringing about peace, harmony and unity. In view of these observations, it is the duty of Indian universities to scrap all references to Akbar's greatness from all educational textbooks and institute chairs to bring out the horrid truth about Akbar's tyrannical regime. From Smith's account, it is clear that Akbar deserves to be ranked with the world's most hated, despicable and evil ruler. Thank you for watching this episode. Please like and subscribe this channel. Hare Krishna, Har Har Mahadev, Jai Sri Ram.